Hey guys, if you like tea time and if you like cool stories, then you've come to the perfect spot because this is Tea Time Tales with Tanisha, myself. So the idea is that I will be sharing a cool story, a folklore, something historical, myths, all that cool stuff while I make my cup of chai. So if this is something you're into, make sure that you subscribe to our button and hit that bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out any of these videos that come out every Tuesday. So today's video is about how a British addiction for tea literally kick-started the Assam tea industry. So we're going to be focusing on two main characters. Well, they're real life people, historical people. Anyways, I think that's characters. So the Bruce brothers, which are Robert Bruce and Charles Alexander Bruce, who are known to be the forefathers of Indian tea. Also, while I make my chai today, of course, it's going to be a cup of masala chai, my favorite way of making it. So if you want to also try out this recipe, you can check it out in the description box below. But I think we are ready to get started, so grab your cup of tea or coffee. Just kidding, coffee not allowed. Grab your blanket, cozy up, because it is time for a tea time tale with Tanisha. Before I really get into it, I must sort of set the stage here for you guys. So we are talking about a time era when a lot of European countries are just traveling around the world, exploring, trading, and taking over. You know, they're just expanding their empires. And of course, at this time, the British Empire is one of the largest ones in the world. You know, that famous saying, the sun never sets in the British Empire. Well, yeah, that's kind of true. So, the British are stationed in India through the East India Company. Since 1600s, they arrived there for spice trade. So while India was one of the British colonies, the Brits at this time were obsessed with tea, to the point that in 1700s, when the tax rates were high, the Brits were actually smuggling tea. So that's a huge risk you'd take at that time, but it was worth the rewards. And not just that, but there were so many cases where tea was being adulterated, which means that they were adulterated? It's a hard word, I'll just put it on the screen somewhere. But they were just mixing up toxic things together that looked like tea. And they would sell those at cheaper prices, cheaper tea. And poor people who just couldn't really afford that expensive, luxurious tea, they would pay for this cheap tea. And you know, their health would be impacted. But it was just a lot of hype, a lot of addiction, and people were just loving tea. Alright, in England. Now, having said all of that, at this time, China is the only place that was exporting tea. China was their only source of tea. So Brits, being as desperate as they were at this time, they were willing to go against the wish of the Chinese emperor, who wanted to keep China isolated from the world, or at least from the Europeans. So the Brits were willing to pick fights against them, and by fights I mean battles and wars, just to make sure that they kept getting their tea. And initially they were buying tea by giving them silver, but eventually the Brits realized that silver is not really sustainable, you know. So what they did was they started growing opium in India, you know, their colony, and they started pushing that in China. And they actually really went out of their way to make a huge chunk of the Chinese population addicted to opium, so that the demand for opium would be high, and they would fulfill that with tea. So it's basically you give them one addiction and you get the other addiction. That's what's happening. And when the Chinese emperor realized what's happening in his empire, obviously he was furious. He did not want his population to be addicted to opium. And so there were wars, and there were battles, and there was taking over, you know, pockets of land. There was a lot of conflict. And The relationship between the English and the Chinese just sucked. They were horrible. Our guy, Robert Bruce, he was born in Edinburgh, England in 1783. He was in the army and worked for the East India Company, so he was stationed, of course, in India, in the Assam region. And when there were no wars, when he wasn't fighting, he was looking after these opium plantations. So the interesting thing here is that one day when Bruce was just strolling along the Brahmaputra River for some trade and exploration, he came across something really interesting. So he saw that members of the Singpho tribe, they were consuming this mysterious leaf. So they were making pickle out of it with garlic and oil, but they were also boiling it in water and kind of drinking something that looked like tea. So Bruce got really curious. It's like, huh, is that tea that I see? So you know how they say that it's about who you know than what you know? Well, this saying, guys, is not very recent. I'm sure this applied then too, because Robert Bruce became friends with the chief of this tribe. His name was BeganI, and BeganI promised Robert that he will supply him with a whole chest of these mysterious tea leaves so that he could explore this further. Unfortunately though, sorry, that's just ginger juice in my eye. Anyways, unfortunately though, next year it was the first Anglo-Burmese war, so Burma, which is modern day Myanmar, was sort of encroaching upon Assam, and the Brits were like, no, you're not getting a piece of our colony. And of course they fought it out, and of course the Brits won. But unfortunately, at the age of 35, Robert Bruce ended up dying in that war because he was a major in the Bengal artillery unit, fighting for the English. That was the end of Robert Bruce. Now Robert also had a brother, Charles Alexander Bruce, who was 4 years younger than him. And Charles was an author, an army man, and also an explorer and a merchant, just almost like his brother. And just like his brother, he also worked for the East India Company, so he was a soldier for them, and he was also stationed in Assam. Charles was part of the fleet, so he looked after like the ships and the river boats and that stuff. Charles Alexander Bruce, the brother, he's the one who ended up getting his hands on this chest of leaves. Now we don't really know how this happened, so did Charles retrace his brother's footsteps and get to Bisagam and asked for those leaves, or did Bisagam come to pay his respect for Robert and give it to Charles? We don't know. And honestly, why does it even matter? Like, does this say something about the relationship between the brothers? Like, were they not in talking terms? Or is it just historians trying to like connect dots? I don't know, but this is what I read. That we don't know how, but Charles ended up getting his hands on these leaves that Robert Bruce was requesting. So Charles, as soon as he got these leaves, he ended up sending them to the botanical gardens in Calcutta, which was run by the East India Company. And the idea was just to get them examined and to see if these are actually tea leaves or not. Because honestly, if they were tea leaves, this could literally change history and the way the British Empire works. Because, you know, if they didn't have to get leaves from China anymore, like their enemy anymore, that would be huge. So our guy was desperate and he sent these. Now this is back in the day when they didn't even have, sorry, I have some ginger stuck. This is back in the day when they didn't really have railway yet. So it must have taken a few days for these leaves to reach the botanical gardens. Once at the botanical gardens, the superintendent there, whose name's Wallish, who's actually a Dutch guy working for the East India Company, he examined the specimens and he was like, sorry but not sorry, these are not tea leaves. Now historians, when they mention any of this, they always say that, not always, in most of the cases, or in the readings I've done, that they were indeed tea leaves. However, back then, tea and the whole world of what the leaves look like and the fact that you can have different species, all of this was a mystery, right? Because they were only getting this from China. So since this Assam variety was different than the Chinese variety, that's probably why Wallish kind of just discredited it and said that it's too different, it's not tea leaves. Until 10 years later, when unfortunately, or fortunately, the Brits, they lost their monopoly over the tea industry in China. So what this meant that at this point, they were desperate to find another place where they could grow their tea. So of course, the East India Company, they figured that India is close enough to China and there have been some tea sightings, or people might have mentioned it, the Bruce brothers, that they've come across tea. So they were like, maybe it is time to really start exploring the option of tea in India. So I mean, these guys were not as calm as I am right now. They were hustling. So they made a group, or like a team of 13 people, including Wallish. It was called the Tea Committee, and they were on it to find alternate places to grow tea. In fact, they were hustling so hard that they sent out spies dressed as Chinese people to China to smuggle in tea leaves, tea secrets, and tea experts, who they just called Chinamen, which I don't think is a nice way of just referring to them. And at the same time, they sent out these official circulars around India to their employees, East India Company employees, asking anyone and everyone to let them know if they've had any tea sightings. So any plants they've noticed that it's like a tea plant, or any tribals people or any community drinking anything that looked like tea. So this is when Lieutenant Charleston, who was stationed in Assam since the first Anglo-Burmese War, so he'd had 10 years of experience in that area, and even he'd noticed that local people were drinking this mysterious drink which looked like tea. So now this was his opportunity to really strike. So he actually got samples of these leaves. So not just leaves, he also got the bulbs, the seeds, and the flowers. And guess what? He even prepared some samples of tea. Like, he brewed these leaves and he sent this whole package to the botanical gardens. Now my guess is this journey would have taken 2 or 3 days, and I have no idea how this tea would have tasted, but apparently it tasted okay, because the tea committee examined all these samples, including the tea sample, and they gave it a big thumbs up. They're like, yeah, this is definitely tea, and they wanted to start this mission of cultivating tea in Assam as soon as possible. Charles Alexander Bruce, whose $1 million idea, or should I say £1 million idea, was rejected 10 years ago, he was the one tasked with trying to grow these tea leaves in Assam. And our guy Charles, he was a big sport, and he said, okay. So what he had to do was he had to work with these Chinese men and try growing this Chinese variety of tea in Assam. Unfortunately, that did not work out, because of course we know today that it's way too hot and humid for this Chinese variety to grow in Assam. But back then they didn't know. They were just trying really hard to find different spots to grow this. Charles Alexander Bruce, he tried to grow this Chinese variety many times in many locations around Assam. It wasn't working clearly. So this is when he really had to tap inside of himself and, kind of just do what he believed in. So he believed in the indigenous Assam tea plant, and more than himself, he also knew that his brother who had died had been onto something, and he truly believed that he could cultivate the Assam variety. So even though he didn't have full support from the tea committee, he took the initiative and really worked so tirelessly and so hard to grow the Assam variety. Now, growing tea gardens in Assam might sound so charismatic to us today. Like, I thought that would have been a fun task, But it actually was not, because back then Assam either had some opium plantations or it had really dense and thick jungles, which meant that of course there was a lot of work to do and a lot of danger lurking around everywhere. So he had a lot of challenges and hardships he had to face. For example, like the biggest challenge, one of the primary challenges I should say, is even getting the local people to help him out and work for him, because they were not really on great terms. Like the tribes people didn't really want much to do with these white men in their area. So getting them on board, their technology of course wasn't that advanced at the time, and they had to clear acres and acres of forests to grow tea plants, to turn them into farmland. Now, if that wasn't enough, because this is forests, they had to fight wild animals who would be lurking around everywhere. This is their home. So I'm saying tigers and leopards and wild boars. And on top of that, they had to train wild elephants to clear out the logs that they were making. So like this is a whole adventurous and dangerous thing I'm talking about. And on top of that, disease was a huge issue in these forest areas especially. So there was malaria, cholera, black water disease. So it really was, like I said, a huge, difficult task, and it could not have been completed if that determination and if that willpower was lacking. But as they say, where there's a will, there's a way, and Charles and his squad, they managed to cultivate the Assam tea leaves within 2 years. The botanical garden, they got these chests of tea leaves, they looked at the samples, they're like, oh, we're good, and they shipped them out to England. The English, they got 12 chests of Assam tea leaves for the very first time ever, and they just held on to the shipment for a few months, just to create more of that hype. And in January of 1939, the very first auction for Assam tea was held in England. So naturally, this tea industry in Assam, it really began to grow and nourish, because a lot of rich merchants and the English people were investing into Assamese tea gardens. A lot of estates were popping up, and Charles Alexander Bruce continued working in helping establish and develop these lands. The Assam tea industry started blooming, growing, maturing, and as it was out of its baby phase, the East India Company just pulled out because it had made a decision that it would focus more on its other projects. So out goes the East India Company, in comes the Assam Company. Things don't change much for Charles Alexander Bruce, because he just keeps working on under this new company. Let's look at Charles Alexander Bruce's resume for a second, shall we? Great resume. He's done some great work. His strengths are leadership, communication skills, working with the tribes people, working with elephants. Amazing, showing initiative, what he believes in, starting this whole tea thing. This guy's pretty impressive. Now, but we must not be biased. We must look at his weaknesses as well. So let's do that. Weakness. Not so great at botany or horticulture knowledge. Oh man, that's a tough one. That's really bad. What should we do? Oh, it's simple. We'll just fire him. And that's what they did. The Assam Company fired Charles Alexander Bruce from the post that he'd held for so many years after he'd established the whole tea industry on his own accord. So I'm just quickly going to go off camera to pour out my chai, which is ready and smells really good, before we continue on. Oh, it smells good. So yeah, that's what happened. Charles Alexander Bruce, he literally risked his life and didn't give up on his own belief and his brother's belief, and actually established the Assam tea industry in Assam. All for what? Anyways, Charles and his wife, they continued living in Assam. They did some missionary work with the poor people near the end of their years. And in 1871, Charles was finally recognized by the Royal Art Society for all the hard work that he'd done in establishing the tea industry. Thank you, finally, giving some credit to this poor guy. And he did end up dying later that year, and he was buried right next to his brother, or at least in the same graveyard as his brother in Tezpur. And that was the story of Charles Alexander Bruce. He's the one who's known as the forefather of the Assam tea industry, but I truly believe that both the brothers, Robert and Charles, they both deserve the title of the forefathers of the Assam tea industry, because had Robert lived on, I'm sure he would have also contributed a lot more to this. Later on, of course, the Assam tea industry, which is one of the largest ones in the world, it drew a lot of businesses, a lot of people. Now we have generations of farmers there. A lot of tea companies are based out of there. The railway was established because of it. So a lot of development has happened in that area since then. And we have these forefathers of tea to thank for that.